with me and said, well, we'd like to take a look at the house you want to buy. And I'd like to walk through it myself because I know the community and I know about what the house will be worth. And that bank underwrote the loan because they didn't want to make a loan that couldn't be paid, because that wouldn't help them, right? They wanted us to pay for 15 or 30 years and collect the revenue. And we wanted them to loan us the money, and we didn't want to borrow more than the house was worth either. So they checked our credit and they checked the property. Then they gave us a loan. They went and recorded that. And anybody could have found out that we owed them money, where the property was, and that if we didn't pay, they could take it. And I remember the guy telling me, because I was young and our credit wasn't that great, hey, I really want you to make these payments. If you don't, it'll be me who calls you. We don't want to foreclose. It costs us money to foreclose. What we'd like for you to do is pay on the house. So a lot of people think that, and so in that video it said, you know, the common perception is that people lose their houses because they're deadbeats or they don't pay or they lost their job. And I think that comes from this understanding that we used to have that no bank would take a house unless it had to. Right? Why would you foreclose on a home when instead you could take the payments? But we don't live in that world, right? We live in what I now call the modern mortgage era, where none of the things I just said are true. Okay? The people who made the loans didn't give a damn if they were paid because they didn't keep them. And so we had companies like Countrywide or AmeriQuest, who at one point sponsored the Super Bowl halftime show, right? Who jumped in and said, we're going to make every loan we can for as much money as we can, because then we're going to bundle them up and sell them, and we don't care if they perform, right? So, and then they said to the people that were making those loans and the brokers that were doing it, make them and make them fast, right? And those people got paid commission. And so if you have the chance to make a $100,000 loan or a $200,000 loan, and you're going to get paid commission on the loan's size, and nobody's going to care if it performs, which one are you going to make? And so it wasn't uncommon for somebody that was a responsible borrower to say, I'd like to buy a house. And for AmeriQuest to say, for example, well, why such a small house? You can afford more house. Remember, we can keep your monthly payment at $650 or whatever. People would say, my God, for that much house, I can pay $650? Oh, sure. Now, they didn't say, oh, by the way, every one of our loans has an adjustable rate. It can never adjust down. It can only adjust up, and it will. And it might double your payment in the next 4 years. That was never mentioned. Because, of course, if you say that to somebody, they'll say, well, I can't afford $1,300 a month. I can afford $650. Well, AmeriQuest knew. They didn't care if you could afford it in 3 years because they weren't going to hold it. So they did a lot of sneaky things from there forward. And this is almost all the subprime lenders. They would call you and say, hey, your rate's about to adjust. Do you want to refi? And everybody thought, well, great, I'll refi. And they'd say, since you're such a good customer, we'll refi. But when you refied, they'd hit you with $20,000 in payments and refinancing payments and prepayment penalties. They'd up what you owed. But hey, your monthly payment stayed the same for a while. And that was all well and good until one day when you needed to refi because you couldn't afford an increased payment. And they said, oh, no, you don't have any equity left in the house. That happened both because house prices stopped climbing and because they sucked the equity out with every turn. Then homeowners were stuck, right? Homeowners then had a payment they couldn't make on a house that they could no longer afford. And it wasn't because they didn't think about what the original payment was. It's because they didn't understand that on page 47 of a document that they were shown for 5 minutes and that was closed at Denny's by someone who couldn't answer questions was going to double or triple their mortgage soon enough. Meanwhile, why would anybody make these loans? Well, they bundled them up and they would sell them, and they were very sophisticated at how they would sell them to big institutional banks. And frankly, institutional banks were especially stupid at understanding what they were buying. And so they would do things like rig the credit scores. And so they'd get a thin credit file that had a pretty good credit score. This might be a new immigrant who their credit score is kind of high, except they've only had one credit card for 4 months. So their credit score is high but not very predictive. And then they would find somebody with a terrible credit score. And they'd say, well, when we put them together, the average is 650. And so they would take these securitized bundles of loans and they would sell them to Wall Street, and they'd say, don't worry, the credit score is a good safe score average. Of course, almost no one in there actually had a predictive credit score. They take those loans, sell them to Wall Street. Wall Street said, well, you know, we know that loans default at a predictable rate over the last 100 years, so we can estimate how many of these will fail. We can take the stream of revenue from these payments and we can sell it to investors. People invested. Of course, they didn't perform as predicted because this wasn't the old game of careful underwriting and checking out the house, right? It wasn't careful credit scoring and making sure someone could pay, and it wasn't loaning what people could afford and what the bank could expect to get back. And so since all the fundamentals have changed, these performed in ways that nobody really predicted except a few really smart people who were paying attention and a lot of consumer advocates on the ground who were saying, we got a problem here. And that's when we saw the collapse, right? We saw the collapse of mortgages, of CDOs, of all sort of asset-backed securities. We saw the collapse of giant financial institutions. We saw the bailout to keep some of those institutions and those people that made these terrible decisions from losing their money. And we fast forward to the foreclosure crisis, and we see a graphic like we saw just a minute ago with every house in an entire neighborhood going through foreclosure. So, if we stopped right there, and we asked anybody, just to listen to that story, hey, should we ever let those same banks and all those same lenders and servicers that collapse the world economy, should we let them take houses without a court looking at it first? Everyone would say, that's insane. We can't trust those institutions. If you said, well, should we have laws that say that even if they can't find those notes that were bundled up and tossed in somewhere, and they don't know who owns it and they don't know whether payments were made, should we just take their word for it and they can just have an attorney say, I swear the note exists somewhere? Was that a good idea? Everybody said, well, no way, right? And yet the laws that we had haven't changed. And if they have changed, they've changed for the worse. And so in about half of all states, it was the law for 150 years or more that you could take a home without going to court. It made some sense in 1880, perhaps, because as I suggested, a bank didn't want to foreclose. They were only going to foreclose if they called that homeowner and the homeowner said, I'm so sorry, I can't pay. And the bank said, can we work it out? And the homeowner said, I really can't. And then the bank often lost money foreclosing, right? They didn't want to do it. And so you didn't need a court involved in some of that because a lot of times everybody sort of agreed, yeah, I can't pay and you have to take it and we got to do this. Now we're in a world where people are being paid to run foreclosure mills, where there are attorneys and businesses that their whole job is just to kick people out. And in fact, that's how they make money. And every time they have to stop and ask a question, call a homeowner, talk to them, it costs them money because it's built on churning these things through with as little work as possible. The result is anybody who's ever called any of these servicers or anybody involved in a foreclosure finds out you can't talk to anybody who has any authority. You wait on hold only to find out that you're in the wrong department. They finally get you to the right department 3 hours later to tell you that that department can't talk to the other department. And then when you send them something to the department they finally tell you is right, they can't find what you sent, right? And so what we've done is we've made it impossible for people to communicate with the lender. The lender's not even in the equation. They can't even talk to the person who holds the note. And the servicer who's collecting the money, you can't really communicate with them either. Then you face foreclosure, and what do? You don't have a right to go to court. In Colorado, we have a 120 hearing, but the courts have stripped it of almost any meaning and said, well, it's a rubber stamp traditionally and typically. And so what you see is foreclosures coming through by the millions. At the same time, in sort of a parallel world, we have attorney generals and the Department of Justice and private attorneys suing these banks, and these banks paying billions of dollars in settlements because they know they're getting it wrong, right? And so what's amazing to me as I sort of look at this is that we have, I think, consensus that the securitization process and that whole changing failed and collapsed the world economy. We have large consensus that millions of foreclosures are flawed. And yet, at the same time, we don't have any real reform of the system. The result is, and the idea here was, access to justice, and the result is that most homeowners I know have a hard time finding an attorney to fight their cause. If they do find a wonderful group like this, or an attorney, a foreclosure resistance or attorney, those attorneys and groups face an uphill battle because they're fighting against powerful, moneyed entities that lobby at every single level you can think of. And then we face another problem, which is because all the facts only changed in the last 15, 20 years, people are constantly having to try to educate legislators and judges as to what's really going on. It's very hard to convince a judge or a legislator, hey, most of these foreclosures aren't about people who don't want to pay. They're about something else, and they think, no, that's not how foreclosure works. And trying to sort of tell them what I just tried to say in a few minutes, and trying to get them to understand that this is an entirely new and entirely broken system is really, really difficult. And so, what I would suggest is the solution is that we have to continue to educate people in power. I am encouraged, maybe I'm a naive optimist, but I'm encouraged that sometimes I see courts
rule against homeowners. And then another case appears in front of that court, and they rule against a homeowner. But sometimes the third or fourth or fifth case starts to tell the judge that maybe they're not making this stuff up. Maybe there really is something happening here. And I know we have people in this room and people around the country who are working to educate and make laws change at the legislative level, and then to set precedent in appellate courts that say that homeowners do have rights, that say that these servicers do have obligations, that say that maybe we should ask questions before we remove people from homes, to suggest that the trustee, who is this neutral party in theory who oversees foreclosures in states like Colorado, should have real responsibilities and real rights to make sure this is a true and valid foreclosure before we proceed. We have to do it. It's a human rights issue. On the back end of these, when we kick people out of homes, and I say we as a community because as a country we're still tolerating this behavior. We've got to stop. When we remove people from homes, we make kids homeless, right? We destroy credit scores. We destroy lives. To say people end up dead over this isn't to overstate it, it's a fact. People end their lives about this. People feel shame. I represent a man right now who was foreclosed while he was current on his loan. He didn't even have a modification. He was absolutely current. The bank foreclosed. He wrote him a letter that said, here are all my payments. I'm current. They ignored it. He called them. They ignored it. And then it was such a fast time frame, he couldn't find an attorney, and they removed him from his house. His neighbors came by and said, why is there a sign in the yard? Why is there an auction on our street? You know, what's going on? Why is your house being sold? He was ashamed, and he hadn't done anything wrong. His credit's ruined, his life has changed, and he's one of millions in the same boat. And so we have to tell both those human stories, and I think we also have to tell the factual story of how we got here and why we can't ever go there again. And you know, I wish I could end on an optimistic note, but I would say this. If anything, we're facing the same problem again. We haven't changed the laws that allow this, and now we're seeing buyers come in and buy up foreclosed homes and turn them into rental properties and securitize the rental streams. So now we're selling rental properties to Wall Street, and we know what the servicers are going to do when they try to take care of rental properties. They can't hold on to paper. They can't keep up with payments, much less make sure if the roof's on, right? And so we've taken the foreclosure crisis, rolled it into what will now be a rental and housing crisis if we don't wake up and sort of prohibit some of this behavior. And so I hope that we're sort of getting educated as a mass, that there's enough of us, a critical mass, that we can sort of hit that turning point. But it's going to take organization and steady resistance. So if you have questions or things like that, I always love to talk about this stuff, as you can see, probably too fast and too long. But I would love to talk to all of you about it anytime. Thanks very much.